right, welcome everyone. I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to join the meeting here and we'll get started. And while we're waiting, if you want to go into the chat and just let us know where you're joining from today, we'd love to hear from you. And throughout the presentation, anytime you have a question, just drop it in the chat and we'll get to as many of those at the end as we are able to. Okay, we'll continue to have people add as we go along, but let's get started. So welcome everyone. This is Emerging Midwest Invasives. This is our year-long series, and today we're going to be talking about Amur corktree. We are recording this meeting just as we've recorded all of our previous presentations. So if you haven't seen any of the others or you've missed some, if you just go to the same page where you registered for this webinar, which is mipin.org/presentations, you can find a link to all the previous recordings as well. So my name is Michelle Belasker. I'm the coordinator for the Midwest Invasive Plant Network. And today, as I said, we're going to be talking about Amur corktree. And come on, slides. There we go. I want to start out by thanking our sponsor for this webinar, which is Mark M. Holman, Inc., which is a landscape architect and contractor firm. They provide design, construction, maintenance expertise to residential, commercial, and institutional clients all throughout central Indiana. Their webpage is at the bottom of this screen, so check them out when you get a chance. Now, before I formally introduce our guest speaker for today, I just want to give you a quick introduction to MIPIN. And some context for how this webinar series was developed. So MIPIN was formed in 2006, and we coordinate invasive species outreach and activities across the Midwest with the goal of reducing the impact of invasive plants in our region. And when I say our region, you see that includes 9 states here, as well as the province of Ontario. And this series was inspired by a survey. Actually, we've been doing these surveys almost every year the last few years. At the end of each year, we reach out to experts across the Midwest and we ask them what species do they consider to be early detection species, meaning they are either not in the Midwest yet, but they're in neighboring regions, or they're here, but they're still in relatively isolated pockets. But in either case, we're really concerned about their potential to continue to spread, and we want to make sure they're on people's radar. So we received feedback from every state and province in MIPIN's region, and these 10 plants really rose to the top of the list, and that became the basis for this series. We've also created a flyer version of this, which is available on the MIPIN website. Another resource that we have for early detection is our terrestrial and aquatic invasive keep a lookout flyers, we call them. They each cover 16 different plants, and I'll put a link to where you can find that publication as well. And just finally here, if you enjoyed this presentation today, if you've been coming to these monthly webinars, please consider making a donation to MIPIN. It really helps us continue doing these kinds of invasive species education efforts. So again, just keep an eye on the chat. I'm going to drop in some links to these resources and the donation link. And thank you again for your attention and for being here today. And I'm going to stop sharing and introduce our guest speaker. All right, we are very happy to have Kurt Dreisilker with us today. He is the head of collections, horticulture, and natural resources at the Morton Arboretum. Since 2004, he's been planning and implementing ecological restoration throughout the Arboretum's 900 acres of natural areas. The Arboretum's status as a public garden and tree museum gives Kurt a really unique perspective on the management of invasive plant species. He has a BS and MS from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he studied plant biology and natural resources management. He was a founding steering committee member of the Northeast Illinois Invasive Plant Partnership, and he served on MIPIN's board of directors since 2012. So you're in great hands. Go ahead and take it away, Kurt.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here and excited to talk about the Amur cork tree, which is kind of a new species for a lot of people. Sometimes people don't know about Amur cork tree. It's not widely known to be invasive, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about the tree today and talk about some of the experiences that we've had at the Morton Arboretum with this particular tree. So I'm just going to jump right in if I can work my controls properly. So Amur cork tree, just a quick background on this, is Philodendron amurense, is part of the Rutaceae. Basically, it was introduced into the United States in the mid-1800s, largely as a shade tree for ornamental purposes. It is found growing in a lot of botanic gardens and arboreta. It has not widely been introduced into the horticulture trade. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So there are a couple other species of philodendron, just to note, and it can be somewhat challenging to differentiate between the species. But today we're going to talk about the Amur cork tree, Philodendron amurense. The last bullet point there shows that there are some cultivars on the market right now. And these are largely bred to be male trees because this is a dioecious species. And so that means, of course, that male flowers are born on one tree, female flowers are born on another. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I can't guarantee necessarily which of these cultivars are widely available at the moment, as I believe that some of these are more available than others at the moment. These have been introduced since at least the 1990s. Okay, so Amur cork tree is named Amur cork tree after the region where it's found in the Amur River region of eastern China and Japan, parts of Korea, and then it can also be found in Russia. This region, the precipitation annually varies pretty substantially, but where the Amur cork tree is found, it usually receives about 24 to 36 inches of rain annually. So that also can correlate with regions of the United States and North America where we can find it today. It's found in montane thickets, montane forests, thickets, and river valleys within this region as well. Since I don't have pictures of it in its home range, I do have, I'm going to include some pictures of it found here at the Morton Arboretum, which is, of course, in northeastern Illinois. And we're about 25 miles west of Chicago, by the way. This is a cork tree that we've had in our collections for many years, and you'll note that the large specimen was planted back in the 1930s, so that tells you a bit about the age of the tree. Cork tree, as noted in the earlier slide, can be found in river valleys, and here you can see it planted in one of our tree collections at Morton Arboretum, which is adjacent to the river that bisects the property here. So you can see a bit of a flooding scenario that's happening when the picture was taken. So it is tolerant of brief inundations and flooding. However, it's also tolerant of escaping and growing in some of the upland forest that we have on our site as well. So this is an image of an oak woodland found at Morton Arboretum with some of these seedlings in this kind of greenish yellow color in the understory. So these are seedlings and saplings of the cork tree in the understory. We've seen lots of seedlings and saplings, like you can tell in this picture, but we've also seen mature trees forming, which can kind of poke through the canopy, and you can find them in, well, we used to find them in larger size classes, akin to some of the larger trees shown in this picture here. Cork tree is found in the hardiness zones 3B up to 7, as shown in the box on the right. And so it does have a relative wide potential distribution in the United States. You can see those colors associating with these zones here in this box, and then how they're associated with the colors spread throughout the country. In the bottom image, you can see the current range shown in green where cork tree is actually found and has been documented. While these colors of these hardiness zones do spread farther west, I suspect that this species will not exactly be found as commonly west because of the limitations that precipitation impose on this species as you move farther west into the U.S. Great Plains. So I'll just show you a couple images of what the tree looks like. Here is a tree that we have growing on the Arboretum property. This is a male tree, by the way, so you might be wondering why we still have a tree such as this. We're going to talk a little bit more about what we've done with this particular species at Morton Arboretum as I go along. But this tree still lives. It's a rather large, beautiful shade tree. This tree has a roughly an even spread and height, so about 40 to 50 feet tall, 40 to 50 feet wide. This one, of course, is growing in open sun, so it has that wide spread. And then you can see the branching structure in the image on the right in the dormant season as well. If we look at the trunk, you can see in this particular, with this particular individual, we can see the open grown structure of the trunk, kind of a short, stout trunk, and then quickly as it grows, it has developed into a wide crown with a lot of larger branches. If you look closer at the bark, you'll see why it has the name cork tree, because the thick corky bark in the image on the left, corky bark, you can actually stick your thumb or your hand on the bark, and you can feel it depressing underneath your thumb or your hand. So it definitely feels corky, although it's not actually used for corks, just as a side note. So that's what the mature bark looks like. In the image on the right, you can see a more youthful tree. That tree is only about 3 inches in diameter. And I want to point out the thinner bark. You can see the lighter or the shallower fissures that have just begun developing in its youth. Those will certainly develop into the fissures that you can see in the image on the left. And then what I've done for that picture is I've sliced into the bark, showing kind of the sapwood color, which has actually a really vibrant yellow color, is one of the surefire ways of identifying cork tree. Although I don't typically recommend cutting through the bark to identify your tree. So if we look at the leaf arrangement and the leaf structure, you can see the image on the left. Cork tree has opposite leaves, and they're compound, pinnately compound leaves as well. You can see kind of the even darker green color on the upper side of the leaf, and then a lighter green on the underside. These series of images on the right, you can see that the cork tree sapling that I'm showing you has the opposite leaves here. On the twig itself, you can see some of these white specks. These are white lenticels. You can see them spreading throughout the tree itself. The opposite leaves shown here in this image. And then I also want to point out that the axillary bud is actually in the petiole. And so if we break off this petiole, like I did in this image here on the right, you can see that's where the bud is housed. So you can see that is what will develop into next year's growth. And then the terminal bud, there's actually a lack of a terminal bud here. So you can just see kind of 2 opposite leaves on the terminus of the twig itself. This tree also is similar. If you're not familiar with cork tree, you may mistaken the identity of this tree for something like black walnut, another tree with, of course, compound leaves. However, the leaf arrangement on black walnut is alternate. So I just wanted to point that out. And then, of course, you can see the axillary bud here, as well as in the center image. You can see the axillary bud in the axis of the leaf as well. Okay, and then I'll also note the small hairs on the stem and petiole of the black walnut. Black walnut is actually just one species that has compound leaves, pinnately compound leaves, I should say. So we might also think of a couple different hickories or other species in general that have pinnately compound leaves to mistaken the cork tree with. So I just wanted to be clear about that. But this is just one example. So we just want to key in on, flip back to this slide here. key in on these opposite leaves, and then this bud formation within the petiole and within kind of enclosed by the leaf scar, as we can see it in this image. So those are some surefire ways. If you can see that, then you can maybe slice into the bark and see that yellow inner bark, and that'll be a surefire way to identify that tree. So if we're thinking about the flowers and the fruit, as I mentioned before, I don't have any good images of the flowers, so I have taken this from one of our former landscape architects who drew this. These are the flowers of the cork tree, so you can see male and female flowers indicated here, and then you can see them sort of to scale in this drawing here, referencing the leaves in the background. The fruit is more of a black or really dark purple drupe, and so you can see there are multiple seeds actually contained within each of these fruiting structures here. And then here's the live image, or here's a real image of the fruit. And this is actually what you would see more like right now, this time of year. So on our grounds at Morton Arboretum, the trees are showing fall color, and then may even show some fruit as well. So just a quick point, I'm going to get into how we've been experiencing this plant escaping from cultivation, but I just wanted to highlight how to control this particular species. As with many other woody plants, trees especially, we might think about some rather typical control techniques. For us, what we've been using is just the cut stump technique. And so we've found large trees. Over time, we've seen them quite large, where they're 12 and 14 inches in diameter, and we've felled those and then treat the stumps with 80-20% 80-20 mix of triclopyr 4. But that same combination of cut stump treatment works well on small saplings as well. And so we pretty much have stuck with this control technique all along. Foliar treatment with something like glyphosate or another herbicide doesn't seem to work as well for us. We've not really fully tested it just because we're quite pleased with the cut stump treatment that I just described. Fire does work pretty well on small seedlings, but it works mainly to keep them under control. So we've seen them actually resprout after fire. It's not nearly as vigorous as some of our oak species or walnuts or other trees that are known to be fire tolerant, but this one can resprout, even if it's somewhat weakened or somewhat lacking when compared to some of these other more vigorous fire tolerant species. And you could imagine that with the thick, corky bark that I've described, the bark itself is somewhat of an insulating factor. So the fire will not so much control the larger trees and will hardly stunt the larger trees. So fire alone is not a very effective tool controlling the cork tree. So it's often used as a controlling factor to help control the population, so to keep them from growing taller, and then to move in afterwards, after the fire, for example, and then control the plants with herbicide and the cut stump method that I described. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here for a little bit and just kind of talk about how this plant has been performing at the Morton Arboretum. And at this point, I kind of wish I was in front of a live audience to see everybody's raised hands, to know if anybody has ever seen this particular species growing in their natural areas or on their properties that they're managing. But maybe in the chat, or maybe you can raise your hands, we can get a sense of who is actually dealing with cork tree right now. I think that'd be kind of a fun thing to do. Maybe Michelle, if you can keep tally on maybe how many. I'd be really curious to know if folks have their own experiences after we're done here, and we can maybe talk about that. But as I mentioned, as a botanic garden and arboretum, as a public garden, really, we have these opportunities to experience these situations. The Morton Arboretum, founded in 1922 by this gentleman, Joy Morton, shown planting a tree, not a cork tree, but a different tree. I'm just showing the slide to kind of dig in a little bit more into the history of the Morton Arboretum and how cork tree has developed here on our property. But at the heart of what we do, this is our mission statement. It's to collect and study trees, shrubs, and plants from around the world and to display them across naturally beautiful landscapes for people to study and enjoy, and to learn how to grow them in ways that enhance our environment. And so our goal is to encourage planting and conservation of trees for a greener, healthier, more beautiful world. So this is our mission statement, and this does not say anything about invasive plant introductions or intentionally doing so. And so I just wanted to point that out because this is really what we do. We take and we collect and study trees and shrubs and plants from around the world. So that means from even the Amur region of Asia, and we bring them to a place on our property and grow them for these reasons. We don't willingly introduce invasive plants. In fact, 100 years ago in 1922, when the Morton Arboretum was founded, we really didn't even know about the concept of invasion biology. And so we've been adopting and adapting our management as we've learned about these things, of course. So as a botanic garden and arboretum does, we collect these plants. We have 222,000 living plants in our collections from 42 different countries, and many of them are actually threatened. And so this is a really important component of the work that we do. So collecting these trees, if they're threatened in their home range, and then planting them onto our property is a way of conserving the germplasm. It's a method known as ex situ conservation, as opposed to net managing natural areas in situ conservation is what we think of there. But I wanted to dig back a little bit into history, and I wanted to show the situation that we may be able to impact today. I'm not using cork tree as an example here. I'm using a different plant, Oriental bittersweet, Celastris orbiculatus. So you can see the picture of this. There was a different botanic garden in the United States that collected this plant and planted it into their property, into their collections. And so in 1897, what they then called the Japanese bittersweet was planted on their property. And so just to highlight what they've seen and then reported on in their publication, that within a few years, large tangled masses of bittersweet appeared on shrubbery and rocks nearby. So the casual observer expressed surprise at the abundant growth of the shrubby bittersweet in the garden area. Then it goes on to talk about how to ID it, especially when compared to the native species in North America. And we can see then that it talks about the color scheme is appreciated by various birds, and they're not slow in taking advantage of the food supply and consequently scattering the seeds, which start new colonies of the vine where they may rest after a time after feeding. So we can get a sense of this plant 101 years ago, planted into the collection of Botanic Garden. The birds come by and do their thing. They eat the seeds, they've defecated out the seeds, and then a new plant or a new population emerges. If we can take effect right then and there, then perhaps we can, help to avoid or help to prevent plants from becoming invasive. And so if we fast forward, I think we know the story for this particular species. This one has spread around throughout much of the eastern US and northeastern US, and you can see the geographic range of it shown here. This image, the invasion curve, is probably familiar to most of us, but it basically shows that as time moves along, we can introduce a plant over here, and then, as in the bittersweet example I just shared, the population growth occurs. And so as time moves along, the increased area the area infested increases, and then once you're over here, the increased control cost is also increased as well. And so this area on the right hand side of the graph is actually what we're probably more commonly dealing with when thinking of invasive plants. But if we were just to go back to 1922 and focus on helping to prevent or to eradicate that small population, we may have a different story today. And it's this scenario over here on the left where I think we're dealing with with respect to cork tree today. So if we have these plants that are spreading, I think we can take a crack at eradicating the population as opposed to controlling it when the population would be so large as in the right side of the screen. And so thinking about what botanic gardens and arboreta do, I am making the proposition that we're actually perfectly poised to function as sentinels against invasive plants. So we have curated collections where we plant trees and shrubs and plants from around the world. Here's just an image of Dawes Arboretum in Ohio. They have, you can see their landscape here, shown with all their beautiful trees and collections scattered throughout their property. Sometimes gardens have natural areas where some of these plants can actually be found as they're spreading from cultivation. Gardens have professional staff members like curators, horticulturists, naturalists, and so on, who can understand what is actually happening with those plant populations. And then we also have databases where we house information about each and every one of these plants. We have labels on the plants as well that help us to track which one's which, so we know how to handle and manage and curate our gardens. So imagine this entire network of botanic gardens and arboreta spread around North America, collecting information about when these plants are escaping from cultivation, whether it's the Celastrus example or cork tree. If all of these gardens are collecting and sharing this information, then we can have quite an effective early warning signal for what might be a concern in the future. This image here actually shows where all the botanic gardens and arboreta are represented in the country and Canada. And just to compare that, we do have, again, the current range of cork tree. So you can start to see where it's emerging in the naturalized settings. This is not representing the botanic garden and arboreta network. But if we think about what is actually happening at Morton Arboretum and what has happened over our 100 years of history, we've actually introduced this tree, this species, over 100 times within our collections since 1922. Currently, we have 11 specimens left within our collections, and you can see they're represented by these red stars. We do have a couple other species, so if you're actually counting them, you'll know that there's more than 11 there. So we do have a couple other specimens, a couple other species of philodendron included in this. But most of those trees were actually, most of the cork trees were actually removed for many different reasons over time because of the way that we've managed the Arboretum. In the last 20 years, we've been catching on and really been reacting to the kind of expansion, the population expansion within the Morton Arboretum. And so we've removed the fruiting trees, as I mentioned, as a reminder, the female trees that are fruit bearing, we've been removing those from the collections. And so when we find a tree that's fruiting, we need to remove those from the collection. So for the most part, those trees are actually male trees. However, some of these trees do continue to surprise us and produce fruit. And so even though we thought they were male trees and they have not produced fruit, over time, we've seen these surprises happen, and then they produce fruit on a given seemingly random year. This phenomenon is something that we really can't explain. However, we haven't been able to look into it as deeply enough to really truly explain what's happening here. We've just been removing the trees as a recommended practice as they produce fruit. So I think there's something interesting happening here. So if anybody's interested in helping to explain this phenomenon, then we should stay in touch. But this has been happening for the past 20 years. So we've removed the fruiting trees, and then, you know, a male tree that we thought was just the male tree seems to produce fruit in a given year, and then we have to go in and remove that. So as a result, we've currently ranked the cork tree as potentially invasive, and this potentially invasive I've listed as such, and I'll explain more about what that means in a few minutes here. but this potentially invasive category is aligned with the broader public garden initiative that I'll be explaining. Okay, so sticking with what we've seen at the Morton Arboretum for another minute or two, by 1987, we noticed that this tree was escaping from cultivation. And so Floyd Swink, who co-authored Plants of the Chicago Region, noted that this was a common and vigorous weed throughout the Arboretum. In the next edition of the Plants of Chicago Region, it was noted that it had escaped cultivation with numerous wild plants, many of them now large plants. And so we can get a sense that the population has grown. We have this kind of increase in size within the individuals as well. So by the time I started in 2004, I was managing the natural areas and finding cork trees and cutting them. And it seemed like every time I turned around, there was another one. So we'd cut it and treat it and so on. And then, a few years later, I kind of got tired of that, and I decided to mobilize our staff and volunteer teams to help control the population throughout the Arboretum. And so each team had their own designated area. Everybody went out to that designated area, cut the trees, counted them, and then treated them as well. And so here are the plants that still remain in the collections. These are the trees that we've intentionally introduced. And then if I include the areas that were assigned to the different teams, we can see these little polygons that have shown up. And we can see numbers within those polygons. And we can see, in some cases, over 1,000 sapling and seedling trees have showed up in these areas. That is a lot of cork trees that have escaped from cultivation. And you can see little epicenters, little higher concentrations in a couple different spots. And I'm not going to go into all the different reasons why it was thicker in some of these areas, but that is an alarming number, I think, by many people's standards. And so after going through something like this, we really had to make sure that this tree does not become the next invasive plant. So we have been actively working on controlling the cork tree population within the Arboretum, as well as scouring the outside of the fence, if you will, surrounding the Arboretum. And we've been doing that for many years already. So just to compare what we're seeing here with cork tree, we also know that many botanic gardens in Arboretum witness plants that escape from cultivation, perhaps not to this scale, but this is a phenomenon that we picked up on a number of years ago and decided to make something of it. So we invited a bunch of our colleagues from the Botanic Garden and Arboretum community to the Morton Arboretum back in 2016. And we essentially launched an initiative that we're calling Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants. And so this initiative in 2016, we gathered everybody to just talk through what we're experiencing within our respective gardens. We're talking through what to consider of these situations. Do we consider a plant invasive when there's 10 seedlings nearby, the mother tree or the plant that was introduced? Or is it invasive when we can find 1,000 seedlings or 10,000 seedlings? And how far, by the way, from that original planting does it need to be to qualify as an invasive plant then? We didn't really have good answers at that time from this one meeting, but what this meeting did is it really helped to pull us together to help us to gain some traction on this concept. And so then we launched this idea. We also knew that there wasn't really a lot of good foundational information, so we wanted to survey the public garden community. There are over 500 public gardens scattered throughout North America. We didn't reach all 500, but in the survey work that we did, we found that actually 91% of gardens have observed plants escaping from cultivation. 89% of the gardens control non-native plants when they're spreading from cultivation. That means those spontaneous individuals are being controlled. 89% of the gardens thought it would be helpful to also learn from other gardens about which species are escaping on their properties and what they're doing about it. But we also realized at that time there was no place for this information to reside. And so where does that information exist? At that point, it didn't exist anywhere. We also found that 65% of gardens actively de-accession the plant taxa that are actually spreading from cultivation. And we can see in this bar chart here, the number of taxa de-accessioned any given year due to invasiveness in one particular garden. In the two images on the bottom, you can see that the burning bush, Euonymus elatus, was actually de-accessioned from the collection and then replanted with other plants afterwards. So what this is saying is that gardens are already doing something. So even by 2016, botanic gardens, public gardens in general, are taking action on this. But there's no cohesive, centralized manner in which this was happening. Gardens were just acting individually in doing this. So here's just a short timeline of our action since that initial meeting. In 2018, PGSIP, the Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants, formed. We formed a working group and we did this foundation building with other North American gardens. We developed standards for gardens to follow because we realized that gardens, again, were doing things individually and we're defining situations differently compared to other gardens. And so we wanted to develop standards so that we could understand larger scale trends among gardens. And then we actually developed a database for the data to land in. And so gardens could enter that in a safe environment where gardens are actually protected behind a registration wall. So breaking the news here, that the database that I'm referencing is exclusively for public gardens. And that's at the request of the public garden community. If you're a public garden member, you can join it and you can see the full access, but then the public will not be able to just because of the concern about what gardens are reporting. There's probably understandably a bit of sensitivity to releasing every sort of bit of data. The consensus, by the way, was that gardens don't consider a plant that is just beginning to escape from cultivation as invasive. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So you can see some of the other work that we've done in 2021. We have been starting to roll out the process. We're recruiting and adopting gardens to participate. 2022, we had stakeholder involvement because after all, the gardens, if gardens alone are collecting and housing this information, what good is that? It's not going to help to prevent that plant from becoming invasive. And so we need to reach out beyond the public garden community to talk to landscape architects, to talk to the green industry, the horticulture trade. We need to talk to invasive plant councils and propagators. And we need to let them know about what we're seeing within our gardens. And when we see a significant amount of data that's pooling about any given taxa, then we are going to produce an alert. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. If you're interested in this information, you can see a website that I've highlighted here with the red arrow, and then you can see our general email address as well. So just quickly showing the guidelines for listing, categorizing, and sharing information. This is a PDF document for gardens, but you can find a PDF link of this in the website. And then even though that's something like a 17-page document, you can read all the details in it. But I think one of the most important things that we did is we came up with 4 different categories to consider classifying or ranking each particular species or taxa when it's being ranked. So as a garden is finding this plant escaping from cultivation within their garden, they can use these ranks to classify that. And then of course we can see the larger scale trend among gardens. Last year in November, we hosted another meeting at the Morton Arboretum, and you can see all the participants here. We actually reached out to these groups so that we could understand how to effectively communicate our story and our data to these audiences to help prevent those plants from becoming invasive. And that was a very effective meeting where we had a lot of good conversation. Again, this was not open to the public. This was just meant to bridge the gap between what the public gardens are seeing and to get that information out to these different audiences to help prevent plants from becoming invasive. So what are the results? This is our data dashboard. So far, we have 29 public gardens participating. And you can see in the map here, the range spread throughout the US and Canada. You can see altogether we have 853 records from these 29 different gardens. So there is a lot of information being pumped into this database right now. The gardens are following these 4 different categories, like I mentioned: invasive, potentially invasive, watch list, and assessed as invasive. So you can see kind of a breakout in this pie chart. And then in the bottom, you can see the most commonly recorded taxa. You can see our friend Philodendron amurense is listed as number 1 with 10 gardens reporting. And then you can see, as you scroll across, the rest of the taxa that are listed the most at this point. So focusing specifically on the cork tree, as I mentioned, we have 10 of the 29 gardens reporting on cork tree. I mentioned that Morton Arboretum is listing it as potentially invasive. The other 9 gardens are not going to be I won't be calling them out individually, but you can see how I've categorized them. 2 are listing the species as invasive, 1 is potentially invasive, 3 watch list, and then 3 more as assessed as invasive. And then the last thing that we're doing is actually producing an alert. And so this particular alert concept is, again, it's a bit of news that the PGSIP working group is actually sending out to our other stakeholders. Our first alert, you might imagine, is our friend, the cork tree. And so this is the first alert that's due out in the very near future. So you're getting a bit of a sneak peek, to this alert. But basically what this is doing is sharing some information about what the garden community is finding within their collections, making points on these recommended actions for these different audiences, sharing some links, sharing the data that we have in our database, the range where the cork tree is being found within these gardens. And then you can see some other features like the plant, and a little bit more information about plants, how to ID the plant, and so on. So this alert is due out in the very near future. So just to wrap this up, I just want to highlight that if you are joining today and you're from a North American garden, we would love to have you join us. And those are the 2 links you can follow. If you'd like to follow us and join our newsletter, you can find that information again on the website. And then finally, if you're a member of the public or if you're managing natural areas somewhere, and you're finding cork tree, then we'd encourage you to report this on EdMaps. And I think that is it. And I want to thank you all for joining today. And I think I'll turn it over to Michelle. I don't know if we have any time for questions.
We just have a couple of questions. So I understand that we're running up against our scheduled time. If anyone needs to leave, that's fine, but we'll stay and answer just these couple of questions. One was about identification. It said, how would you distinguish, I think, a young cork tree and a young elderberry?
Okay, the young cork tree, so they both have pinnately compound leaves. The elderberry, so Sambucus canadensis, will have a groove in the rachis, in a groove in the petiole, essentially. And then if you snap that off, you will see the leaf bud. However, the leaf, as I mentioned in the image, the cork tree will have the axillary bud completely enclosed within the leaf petiole. So that would be a big feature. Both of those particular species have kind of a similar color fruit. If you break open a fruit, the drupe of the cork tree, you'll see it is broken down further into more pieces. So I think there can be up to 5 components or seeds within the drupe. Elderberry, I forget how many there are within the elderberry fruit, maybe just 1 per fruit structure there. Of course, elderberry is a shrub, so you'll find the shrub form. So you'll see multiple stems coming out of the roots. Cork tree is a tree, so it'll grow primarily 1 stem out of the root as well. I think those are the main features that I would use.
Okay. And then we had a question about the reproduction of the tree. It said, is that similar to male cultivar ginkgo trees, that a male tree will revert and start producing fruit at, 15 or 30 years of age?
So this issue is a bit of a mystery to me. So I think what we need to do is pay close attention to the trees that are being cultivated and propagated for male flowers or for lack of fruit. I think just following a careful process to make sure that the scion or the above ground part of the plant is actually what we think it is, and then following it for a longer period of time to ensure that it's not actually producing fruit. I suspect that there may have been mix-ups in that process in the past, maybe with other species. I don't know specifically with the ginkgo, but we've seen some different situations happening over time with some of these trees that are thought to be one gender and they're actually not. So it's I think, a bit of careful follow-up on the plant propagation side of things, but also making sure that we fully understand the reproductive traits of the plant.
All right. And then we had one more question just drop into the chat. It said, have you tried using glyphosate for cut stump treatment?
Um, I don't think we have, to be honest with you, because we've pretty much stuck with the 80/20. We found that to be successful, so that's what we've been using all these years.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everyone again for being here today. If you scroll through the chat, you'll see some links to additional information, how to report, how to learn more about the Public Gardens program. Let's see here. Yeah, so if you have any questions at the last minute here, you can reach out to Kurt. I think he'd be fine with that. You can email him with any follow-up questions, or you can reach me at mippin@mortonarb.org. Our next webinar will be on Japanese hops, and then we have a kind of a last minute addition. We're going to be talking about porcelain berry in December. So make sure you can sign up for those anytime. And this will be recorded if you want to come back and view it again later or share it with anyone. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.